Urban planning and design are often mentioned when talking about expansions of cities in the Eastern Bloc. So let's dive deeper into this topic. In this video, I will talk about the complete evolution of urban planning and design of the Central European Eastern Bloc countries since the end of the Second World War in 1945 to around 1990. The whole region is filled with hundreds of various city projects to study, so we will take a look at quite a few, mostly residential, to directly illustrate what I will be talking about, so it's not just a general theory. Meanwhile, in the background, in 1970s Altengrad, I will be building the first part of a new huge city expansion, located just past the new hospital complex, but I will talk about the build later. First, let's divide the whole post-war time period into phases to provide some basic introduction and establish some timeline. The 1945 to 1949 is a phase of continuation of pre-war projects, pre-war ideas, new experiments, but mostly rebuilding after the war. Then, 1949 to roughly 1956 is the time of Socialist Realism architecture, which was strictly mandatory for new city projects in the Eastern Bloc countries of Central Europe. I covered the style in more detail in episodes 57 and 59, so you can go watch that. After 1956, Socialist Realism ended, and to around the middle of 1960s, projects were built with, once again, the modernist ideas, using the young, new, concrete prefabricated technologies. Since the late 1960s, throughout the 70s and first half of 80s roughly, is the time of the largest residential expansions of cities, using already matured concrete panel prefabrication and employing the latest trends in architecture and urban planning. And the last phase is the very late 80s to early 90s, when we would see a departure from the modernist theories back towards some classic city-building principles as problems of the previous projects became known. In this video, I'm going to be talking a lot about classic and modernist approaches to the plans and designs. We introduced the modernist theories in episode 64 in more detail, so again, you can go rewatch that. But just a quick recap. Cities used to be very dense, extremely dense actually, around the times of the Industrial Revolution. And they were built with the classic principles, like establishing main streets, main squares, and mostly using mixed functions, so mixing together places to live, shop, work, and travel. Modernist or functional approaches, on the other hand, wanted a complete switch. So separation of functions, lower densities, no classic streets, no classic squares, huge green open spaces, lots of air, lots of sunlight for healthier living conditions. And all of that using modern construction technologies. This is something that's absolutely essential for this whole time period. We will see how the modernists wanted to fix cities, fix people even, but also perhaps how they went a little too far. Which was logical at the time, since it was a direct answer to pretty bad living conditions of around the end of the 19th century, but also the first half of the 20th century still. Modernism added some more elements on top of just fixing things though, and behind some of the principles is the idea of creating utopian cities. Let's now take a look at each of the phases in more detail in the Central European countries to see some differences, but also surprising similarities that perfectly illustrate the trends and their evolution. After the Second World War, many cities were in ruins, but certainly not all, even in the more affected countries. Czechoslovak cities were, for example, on average relatively lightly damaged, so in a way they had a head start to build new housing projects instead of focusing on repairs. This is Ostrava, where there is this oldest housing project. Such projects are commonly called the 2 years because of the Czechoslovak 2-year post-war economic recovery plan in 47-48 when these were built. The layout is very strict barracks-like, and indeed, these were basically workers' barracks built at the start of the heavy industry expansion. So standardized plain brick buildings, just one type, super simple layout, although the departure from classic city building principles is clear. Houses do not respect or follow the streets, they are freestanding, not forming even hints of blocks. Orientation is done mostly after the cardinal directions, and there is generous green open space between the buildings for plenty of air and sunlight. On the other hand, there are no amenities, no main street, no square where people could gather or shop. Nothing like that, just super simple, yet modern housing. That's it. In Prague, we can find this area, and specifically these buildings that are actually just two-floor row houses with little gardens. The layout is super simple, just like before. This place, due to its scale, already got a big elementary school, and later in the 1950s, some other amenities as parts of these larger five-floor buildings. Here we can start to notice that principle of functional separation. Residential areas are clearly divided from everything else. Shops are concentrated to the middle strip with the park, and transportation is separated on the sides with the main avenues. A project to house new workers also moving in to work in the expanding heavy industry can be found in Nová Huta, Kraków. This district is mostly known for the Socialist Realism architecture, but this part on the side of it, neatly recognizable because of the red roofs, is built just before Socialist Realism took over, so it forms some sort of a bridge between the two phases. Unlike the super plain barracks in Ostrava, here we already have some light indication of the classic blocks, but the buildings are similarly plain. It's basically one type combined into shorter and longer forms. All buildings are still freestanding, and there are very generous open spaces. We can see little almost squares with a few shops and also buildings with commercial first floors on the main avenue, at least on one side. There are not that many new projects from this time period. There certainly are some more, but directly after the war, focus was mostly on demolishing the badly damaged buildings, clearing rubble, and fixing the fixable buildings. But why are these limited examples in this time period important is exactly the illustration of continuation of the pre-war modernist and functionalist styles, just to show that this was already done before the war. But now, Socialist Realism would put a stop to that. Socialist Realism suddenly became a mandatory architectural and planning style in around 1949 in Central Europe, depending on the country. It meant a return to the classic city principles and ditching the separation of functions and other modernist ideas, although some contemporary trends remained, and it depended on the architect how it would be implemented. Political pressures were also crucial here, especially for the more exposed projects where following some Soviet examples was strongly encouraged. Going back to Ostrava, and specifically this part over here, notice how it brutally doesn't continue the previous layout or even street orientation, which just showcases that huge sudden switch of styles. We can see the return to blocks and establishing the main street and squares. Buildings are not freestanding anymore, and they are respecting the infrastructure. Actually, buildings work with the infrastructure, with the main avenue or streets to create some sort of monumental feel. Buildings next to the important places provide the commercial first floors, and the main street provides bus stops in this case. So overall, there are lots of places with mixed functions: residential, commercial, and transportation. Common thing for Socialist Realism is the monumental nature, which heavily uses symmetry. The monumentality is arguably a bit over the top in some places though. Standardization was used, but corners, fancier buildings, and so on must have been custom. Schools or community centers, cultural centers, are inside the blocks, and in this case actually forming some fancier centerpieces of the inner blocks. Let's now see a couple of other examples just to see the layout differences. Ostrov is the city that I showed in that real-life video some time ago. Here we can notice that there are only a few blocks, most of which are not even complete. Majority of buildings are freestanding, but even then there is very heavy focus on symmetry, and the fact that the whole place is heavily planned just screams from it, which is very typical for Socialist Realism. What's also very clear here is the division into units that are themselves following some symmetrical patterns, but each unit is different. In this particular case, the layout unit doesn't really translate into amenities unit or micro-district, which is the term used in the Soviet Union that you probably already heard. This city and the units are not large enough for each one to need all levels of schools, shops, clinics, and so on. But we can think of each unit as, for example, school unit, kindergarten unit, square or commercial unit, and so on. We will later see a project where the units are much clearer. We have already seen and talked about Nová Huta in Krakow many times, but here I just want to show it once again to illustrate the different approach to socialist realism layout in Poland in this case. The uniformity and symmetry here only applies to the more prominent areas, the geometrically important places to push that monumental nature. But as we can see, the inner blocks are already a little more chaotic, with more freestanding buildings and even an occasional point section, which is quite rare in socialist realism. However, the same principles apply, including the division into some neighborhood units. So overall, socialist realism was not a complete return to old city building, just older principles, but working with the contemporary ideas of providing healthier living conditions through enough air, sunlight, and open space, but not as strongly as modernism. However, the push for monumentality using some main streets or avenues, so not separating traffic function, would eventually result in very heavy traffic through some of the socialist realism projects. Industry was clearly divided. Obviously, you cannot really have a steel mill inside of residential areas now. Socialist realism caught the heavily war-damaged cities during their rebuildings, so there are plenty of projects in those as well as other city expansions. But we have many more things to cover in this video, so let's move on. If you would like to compare socialist realism and modernism some more, I highly recommend finding the 16 Principles of Urban Design, which is a set of rules for East German socialist realism cities, and compare it with the Athens Charter, which is a super important text for modernism, basically a set of clearly written rules. After around 1956, socialist realism was abandoned as it lost the political backing and was deemed too expensive. Architects and planners gladly dropped it. From around 1956 to late 60s, they would return to the current functional modernist trends in both architecture and urban planning, and work a little more freely on other ideas, experiment with some new stuff, and so on. Technology-wise, bricks quickly started to disappear, and prefabricated concrete panels would take their place. However, the panel technology was still very young. Let's return to Ostrava, to the same district as before once more. The layout of this place remained from socialist realism, but newly developed prefabricated houses were used instead. We can clearly see the limitations of early prefabrication. The segments are much simpler, we don't see many custom buildings like corners or bends, and as a result the blocks have more uniform geometries, since it simply wasn't possible to do fancier shapes. There are only a few custom buildings around the main street, as they needed to provide the mixed use as per the original plans, allowing that busy main street. Schools were done just like before on the inside, although unlike socialist realism, the school buildings are significantly less fancier, so they are even placed in slightly less prominent locations. Very similar situation is here in Prague, in the largest residential estate from this time period. The whole place was also planned for socialist realism architecture, but it was never even started in it. So the initial design was reworked to employ the new standardized full panel houses. That is a slightly different situation from before. Here the previous layout is much less pronounced, and the new modernist changes are much clearer. We can still see blocks, although only near the main avenue and without any customized sections like corners. Blocks then start to dissolve further away. The main street is considerably less important, as the standardized buildings cannot have a commercial first floor, so dedicated commercial buildings must have been built instead near the main street, but not really creating any sort of square. It's just places to pick up stuff and go home. Another modernist change is the three towers near the entrance. This was not part of the socialist realism plan at all. Notice also how they are placed asymmetrically, unlike the high focus on symmetry in socialist realism. This is actually a very important change even for later projects. Another thing to note is that these towers are custom, since the early panel systems did not offer a standardized tower or point section. It also means, and this can be seen in other projects too, that the tower is fancier compared to the linear standardized sections. This is actually quite rare in the following projects, and it only highlights a tiny bit how in these times rationalization was not yet that extreme, so these customizations were still possible. It also highlights that architects really wanted to start building towers, or generally just start building tall, but the technology, standardized technology, wasn't quite there yet. In Germany, we see mostly smaller scale projects and continued repairs of damaged city parts. The projects are also a little less complex, basically simple residential expansions without that thorough urban plan. Buildings from this and also the Socialist Realism times are commonly called the Altneubau, or old new buildings, meaning that it's some sort of a bridge, like a middle phase between the very old pre-war structures and modern concrete panel housing later. The Altneubau can be frequently found all over East Germany in very similar layouts. Here we have it in Dresden, in place of destroyed old city blocks near the center. The buildings are already made of prefabricated concrete blocks, not panels just yet. They are very plain, highly standardized, so one type only, and using the principles we outlined earlier, so less dense layout, freestanding buildings, not respecting the streets mostly, and so on. These places also don't provide many amenities. They are more often than not simple and, to be fair, smaller housing expansions. When used to fill old city blocks in the inner city, it's not that big of a deal to only do housing, since it works with the rest of the city's amenities, but it is a problem further in the outskirts, which can be found as well. Freestanding buildings, especially when they are not so long, offer excellent walkability through the areas, especially in the communist spirit when there are no fenced-off private parks or inner yards. This is common for all of the countries and many projects where such layouts exist. A quick look into Pécs, Hungary, where this district was built between Socialist Realism and right after it, so it has some combinations of the two styles. Nevertheless, clear similarity in terms of layout with the German Altneubau and even some of the Czechoslovak freestanding Socialist Realism examples. In Poland, in this time period, we can for example look at Lodz, where we can nicely compare the very old and the new, where the difference is night and day. The approach that street line is lava is absolutely clear here, as well as the lower density. Most of the houses here are a combination of Socialist Realism, where the classic principles are a little bit more obvious, and the rest is later 50s, early 60s. So actually somewhat similar looking to the German Altneubau again. Similar looking expansions and city repairs are seen in Warsaw and in countless smaller projects in the whole Central Europe, especially then in smaller cities where there really didn't need to be a complex, fully equipped expansion, but just a few neighborhoods here and there. Moving on to mid-1960s, when this very large place started to be built on the outskirts of Lodz. Here we have a perfect division of housing, traffic and industry, but all still very close. The residential buildings are already prefabricated concrete panel types, but they do not yet offer much variations. Layout is super uniform, actually once again similar to the German examples, but this time with a much larger scale, with a more complex selection of services, which is just the result of the scale. It's not a mundane city expansion anymore, but a whole new planned district. All buildings are freestanding without even an indication of a block. There is nothing like a main street, but we can notice that most of the road intersections have dedicated commercial or service buildings with some paved areas around, but I would not really call those squares. The most common buildings are 5-floor sections, but we are getting higher also with 11-floor standardized linear sections and standardized towers, although some of the towers are still custom with actually quite rare commercial first floors. The taller buildings are closer to the central areas, which is going to be important later as well. The place is very obviously divided into the units, but let's not deal with that over here because the next example will show that by far the best. Poznań in mid-1960s and the start of this project, which is looking similar to Lodz with that super uniform placement of buildings. We can also notice the absolute disregard for the orientation of the main avenue, which unfortunately cuts the place, but it provides public transport. The ordinary linear sections are 5 floors tall again, but we can start to notice the use of not just taller, but also much longer buildings, although taller too, since there are also 18-floor towers lining the main avenue. We will talk about this thing with tall buildings in somewhat geometrically prominent locations later. It's just interesting to see that at this time point, it was already happening. This place was planned using the functional divisions, and just like in Lodz, there is an industrial zone nearby. Now, for the neighborhood unit divisions. Did you notice that there are repeating patterns to the buildings? I'm going to highlight them here, and yeah, that's exactly it. In this case, these units, these patterns, are already large enough so each have their own kindergartens, elementary schools, and large playgrounds. Couple of these units then share some basic administration, public transport stops, shops, pharmacies, and the largest groups share high schools or clinics. This is certainly not something unique to this project. It is present in other locations, but here it's also combined with the clear building patterns that highlight the divisions very well. Let's explain this topic a little more. The unit division is mostly described for city expansions in the Soviet Union. The micro-districts there are very clear when looking at cities from above. And also the micro-districts are called that, so it's very easy to spot them. There are also numerous sources that explain micro-districts in great detail, describe all the requirements, number of people in one unit, its maximum area, distances between some of the amenities buildings, and so on and so on. The principle is nothing particularly new. It was described in the early 20th century already in New York City, for example. In Central Europe, the principle was implemented differently by different urban planners, and it highly depended on the current requirements by the standardization, or even some political pressures. In general, the stricter divisions into some sort of self-sufficient units is a little more prevalent in Socialist Realism and the earlier modernist expansions up to around 1970. Since then, divisions are not as strictly applied, and you can, for example, find bigger areas with shops or like school areas with multiple schools side by side, basically dividing the whole district into some residential, commercial, education, and leisure areas, or just overlapping the amenities between some pseudo units. This topic is really hard to simplify. That's why it's so much better to see how it was actually done on some examples, because then it's clear that there were some common elements, but the final execution is unique for that one particular project. On this example from Brno, from earlier to mid-1960s, I would just like to illustrate the evolution of layout and design. Somewhat similarly to Poznań, we see that architects not only wanted to build taller, but also much longer. The idea of blocks is totally gone, and it's replaced by very long sections placed in an actually chaotic way, not sharing orientation and not forming any unified patterns. The somewhat chaotic nature is reinforced with the use of point sections in these areas to the west, so something completely different than in the rest of the district. And there are also tall tower sections just evenly distributed around the area. We can also see almost exactly the same approach very far away in Gdańsk, Poland, with this mid-1960s design. Here, the Polish architects used similar basic style as before in Poznań or Lodz, but used much longer buildings. In some places, we can spot the neighborhood units, similar to Poznań, although it's a lot more diluted in the rest of the area. We can also see the irregular orientations of the very long sections, exactly like in Brno previously. But the most remarkable thing here is the over 800 meters long section, finished in the early 1970s. Here, the architects, on the other hand, probably started to understand that this is a little too much, so they introduced at least the little wave pattern to break that insane length. This place is a perfect transition into the next phase. The large brand new residential estates on the city's outskirts would become much more common starting from the later 1960s. Architects and planners could now more commonly employ the modernist approaches in design and the somewhat utopian ideas for highly planned modern cities, since the technologies, industry, but most importantly scales of the projects and politics allowed it. The housing crisis was still a big problem and now actually even more pressing since the strong post-war generations, baby boomers basically, reached the age to start their own families. But there were other reasons too. Overall, the 1970s saw the largest city expansions, which can be illustrated by, for example, East Germany, where the, quote, housing program, end quote, was approved in the early 70s to build fully equipped huge residential districts. In Czechoslovakia, more than 50% of all prefabricated houses were built in the 1970s. Let's start in the earlier 70s. This is Magdeburg in Germany. The current architectural trend is clear here. Build as tall as the technology allows you, in this case 10 floors for the long linear sections and 16 floors for the point or tower sections. This allows you to clearly separate the functions, so use small footprints to house lots of people in tall structures, and then have huge open spaces around that, with also large separations from roads, which are only supposed to function as the traffic connections, not places to shop or gather. There are no classic streets, no typical squares. The central intersection is a somewhat prominent area geometrically, so it clearly must have very tall towers right next to it. The linear sections of buildings do form some hints of blocks, but this is actually more typical for German cities only. These pseudo-blocks might seem like the neighborhood units, but they only have a kindergarten each, while other schools, shops and amenities are concentrated into separate areas, so the unit division is a little diluted again. All of the kindergartens and schools are in the typical German standardized types of buildings. This place also has an industrial zone right next to it, so another example of the different functions of different areas. This is one of the largest, up to this point, new projects in Prague. Let's start with what this place does not have, so that is blocks, main square, main streets, and symmetry. Symmetry was avoided like the plague here, and when you look closely to some of the elements that might seem symmetric, they are really not. But apart from that, this place has everything. Wild variations of heights between 2 and 21 floors, different lengths of tall and short linear sections, tower sections alone and combined into doubles or triples, a couple of small row houses even, wild differences between building distances, and so on and so on. One thing that is worth mentioning though is that the super long linear sections are no longer the main design element, and they will gradually go out of style from now on. Another thing that is clearly falling out of favor are the seemingly random building orientations. Projects from now on follow the 90-degree geometries and work a lot more with the road layouts, even with buildings parallel to the roads, so seemingly departing from some of the modernist principles. Just a quick example from Poland, how some architects simply preferred different styles. In this case, using towers only, but also combined into different configurations with different heights and layouts to somehow attempt to break the uniformity. Although do notice that the 90-degree geometries are still present in this place, just like before. This place also later got the interesting-looking corncob towers. Hungary and a 1970s through to 1980s project. Hungary has overall slightly different design of the residential estates with higher building densities, and in this particular project there is one basic principle done differently which affects the overall design. The place follows a linear functional division. We have the main road cutting the place in half, forming a stripe or like a lane of transportation function. Then on the side of this road there are larger commercial centers. Next to that, we have the residential stripe, and on the very edges, we have the stripe for education, sports, and leisure. So actually almost textbook division according to the modernist Athens Charter. However, the buildings clearly work with the road grid, and there is little to no separation between them and the residential sections, which is simply the result of the higher density of the area, which was most likely some decision through some housing plan pressures, as with other projects, as we will see. But still, as with the previous place, there are also wild height variations, towers placed randomly next to linear sections, and overall chaotic selections of buildings in various locations. Let's pause now for a bit and talk about the various trends of using wildly different heights and lengths of buildings, fearing the symmetry, using weird geometry, or on the other hand, some strict yet asymmetric uniformity. This topic is actually nicely illustrated by some interviews with architects and old television clips from the late 1960s where planners were introducing some of their projects. Architects always presented the places using simplified wood or styrofoam models where the buildings obviously looked nice and shiny and overall it just looked okay. Typically then, an architect would talk about the overall composition of the area using words such as expressive, pronounced, distinctive, and highly emphasizing the large green spaces. Important were also some overall viewing angles from afar, so not having uniform roof heights was important for some designers in that regard. So if you imagine that those are the main goals of the layout design, then all of the tall towers piercing the uniform roof levels, tall lines contrasting to the large open spaces, zigzagging patterns breaking symmetry, it all makes sense, right? It's basically like playing city skylines and trying to make it look good for a Reddit post. But is this seemingly chaotic design, from the human perspective, at all important to the end user? This is a larger estate in Gdańsk, where we can see these clear hexagonal patterns. Now, is the pattern something that provides a great living environment, or was it just an architect's attempt to present a geometric experiment to make it different for the sake of making it different? This is overall a difficult topic. Architects could not freely design the buildings in vast majority of projects, just like the urban planners were not able to stray away too much from the established principles, so they at least tried to break away from the gray uniformity with the layout. The whole political, societal and economic systems had too much inertia. That is exactly why the modernist approaches and the industrialized housing construction were already heavily criticized in the West, with new projects using some postmodern or almost classical approaches, unlike the Eastern Bloc, which would continue building as before much longer. Let's also touch another important aspect. There are so many residential estates all around Central Europe. Some of them were simply assigned to architects and planners that just wanted to get it done and move on, get it over with. So they would simply open the standardization rulebooks, which dictated the building's spacings, orientations, number of parking spaces, shops, playgrounds, schools. They placed it all down, shuffled the buildings around so it doesn't look like military barracks too much, and just walk away from it. That's it. Interviews with architects from Czechoslovakia describe such practices, especially for smaller cities, less prestigious projects, or in cases when the planners just gave up after being stuck with the rigid restrictions of the monopolized construction companies and panel manufacturers, and some political pressures, of course. So not every panel housing estate was an attempt to build a better utopian socialist world. Some, arguably a lot, were done to just check a box. Some architects admitted that they avoided the prefabricated projects at all costs, if they could, as there was no way they would be able to build a quality estate with all the restrictions and reality of the construction process. This is the South City in Prague, the largest panel housing estate of the country. Planning of the place went fine. Architects and urban planners had plenty of experience with previous projects and correctly identified several mistakes, like lack of services in the initial years, not enough jobs, lack of quality public transport, and so on and so on. But for some reasons, political decisions were made that the individual units or different parts of the estate will be designed by different independent groups, and higher than planned buildings must be built to push quantity and fulfill the housing plan. And on top of that, the construction process had exactly the same problems as estates before it, but now amplified by the huge scale. So, complete lack of amenities in the early years. The planned metro line was extended here 4 years after people moved in, and the whole area just remained a typical distant residential suburb, looking like a never-ending, muddy moonscape construction site with nothing to do. The planned industrial zone next to this place was never built. Actually, instead of the industry, more housing was later added to make things even worse. We have to understand one thing. As we move in time, we also move in space away from the city center, because the previous projects already filled the empty spots, so now we must move to the open at the outskirts. That is exactly why the lack of amenities, jobs, rapid public transport, and overall things a city needs are crucial here more than before. That is why these places got the nickname hostels in Czechoslovakia, at least, because people simply left for work in the morning, traveled very far away, then returned home in the evening and just went to sleep since they spent long time traveling and or since there was nothing else to do. Things considerably improved, though, over the coming decades, depending on the specific estate, of course. But we will touch this subject in more detail in the 1990s videos, when we reach the modern refurbishments, and I will most likely talk about this in some living conditions videos as well. The 1980s mostly saw a continuation of the 70s projects, since they were simply too large to finish in just a couple of years, plus the countries already started to struggle economically. There were various residential projects of the 80s that were exactly that checkbox projects, as I mentioned earlier. So basically quantity housing first, with bare minimum of everything else. Sometimes even below that minimum, as amenities buildings were never finished. Not everywhere, of course. But most importantly, there was a significant shift in urban planning and design. Let's take a look at Berlin. First, the Marzahn district from the late 1970s to have some reference. Here we can see same things as before, although with the more typical German use of large pseudo-blocks. But again, there are tall towers, different heights of linear sections, and overall a little chaotic layout. And now, I'm going to keep the same zoom level, but I will just move to the nearby estate in Hellersdorf, which is a couple of years younger, from around mid-1980s. Notice the difference? It's not that super pronounced, so let's examine it. We now have the blocks more closed, although not fully. They are much smaller than before, and overall the place is a lot more compact and working with the road layout almost completely now. There are no wild height variations anymore, maybe 1 or 2 floors for the linear sections. There are only a handful of towers, but probably in like older parts of the district. We can also spot something like a square already, but still with the typical central commercial building, so not mixed with residential just yet. We even see careful symmetry. This is one of the earlier examples of, as some sources would say, the post-modernist approach. The critique of the modernist projects was becoming very loud finally in the Eastern Bloc too. The most common complaint was the chaotic layout of places where people had problems to somehow connect with the area and the overall anonymous feel associated with that. Also, and this is a very interesting point, the previous residential estates, even though they are built very loosely with actually not very high population densities, they apparently felt strangely dense or intimidating, with the tall buildings alone in the open or huge open spaces with mega barriers on all sides. Of course, the grey concrete monotone nature of the prefabricated systems did not help that, but there was close to nothing the architects could do with that, as the construction industry or central planning wouldn't budge. So planners revisited the basic modernist ideas and decided to drop some of them and actually make an almost full comeback to the classic city building principles. Another important point is that the idea to build some utopian cities is now completely abandoned. Scale of the future projects won't favor it, and it didn't really work in the past anyway. So designers from now on toned down the idea that the living environment must shape humans according to some ideology. This place in Bratislava is from the mid to late 1980s. We still see a few loose towers from the earlier designs, but then there is the newer part with the classic street with moderately tall buildings lining them from both sides. Unfortunately, that typical 80s push for quantity is present here, although here it at least doesn't create the stupidly tight places as in other projects in the country. However, there are then these symmetrical rectangular blocks and even a completely pedestrian-only street, quotation marks, surrounded by mixed-use buildings with other amenities. Typically, for the 1980s, the place is overall much smaller scale. Prague, and this is probably the most extreme example of the very late 80s. We have super strict blocks all of a sudden, with shorter buildings much closer together. Streets now look almost like in a city center, but there still isn't a typical square. We can see that commercial building forcing its way into that corner, but it doesn't provide some kind of open plaza. The streets are all actually dead ends, so it bans continuous traffic. Walkability was taken care of with cuts through the blocks. This place arguably doesn't work very well because of this much uniformity in combination with the super standardized panel buildings. And finally, Lodz in the very early 1990s, and basically an absolute return to classic city building, but still with concrete panel prefabrication. There are blocks and finally also a square with plenty of shops in the first floors. No major road through the place. It is somewhat orderly, but not too much. There is plenty of symmetry and it's overall very compact. Buildings are comfortable 5 floors, with a couple of floors higher around the main square, which makes so much more sense this time as it makes the square busier, which is its purpose anyway. We can also see some decorations of the buildings, maybe a little kitsch in the typical early 90s style, when architects just tried what may or may not work in the new times. No towers anymore, and thanks to the open blocks without fences yet, the whole place at least seems nicely walkable. Something like dividing into neighborhood units is gone, or at least very well hidden. It seems that amenities like kindergartens or libraries are mixed into the residential buildings with a larger school on the side of the area. And that's it. That was the evolution. I of course did not look at all of the city projects of the whole region. Yes, I know there are places that are larger, more iconic, famous, infamous maybe, but there are just too many, okay? This is still not all when it comes to the topic of housing projects. There will be plenty more videos focusing on some different things. But now, let's go back to Altengrad. I would really like to just briefly mention the time-lapse today because it's pretty self-explanatory what I'm doing here, and it heavily ties to what I was explaining with those real-life examples. So it's exactly that, yeah? Now, some kind of technicalities though. I was heavily using custom roads made by the Road Builder mod because I really wanted to go for some customized intersections and this roundabout and all these different things. So that was very nice that I finally have these like modern looking intersections in the city, yeah? Now, I also decided that these main avenues are going to be completely new. They are not going to be some kind of old roads because these new avenues are now built according to the cardinal directions almost perfectly, so that even these buildings next to them can have some preferential orientations. This time I was really paying attention to the orientations of buildings and I was directly copying some real-life blocks, mostly from German cities, because these buildings are made by Meister Monis, like 99% of them in here, so I was taking inspiration from Halle, Leipzig, Frankfurt, the smaller one, not the big one, but also Warsaw, for example, in this block with these like offsetting linear sections. That's exact direct copy from one of the places in the north of Warsaw. I forgot the name of, but even that like irregular pattern of the path in the middle is exactly from that place. And then I was just, doing some things how I wanted to. Now, I guess I took some like principal inspiration from the South City in Prague, in a sense that in that project, the architects were designing like different parts of the estate. So that's why the different places there look slightly differently. So that's exactly what I did over here. And I'm also thinking that the place is just going to be gradually built in like different, phases. So different styles would be used and all of that. I suppose I went a little overboard with, different things in here, but I will probably unify it a little with the following projects. But right now we're just starting, so it's not that big of a deal. I was placing lots of decals in this area. There is just like an indication of this construction site of the new tram line. It's just tracks right now without any catenaries, but all of the places in here are supposed to look like they are brand new. So there's just mud and dirt everywhere, fresh from the construction sites, and there is like a huge dirty moonscape behind the area, which is indicating the overall scale of this place, how it's eventually going to grow, yeah? Because this is far from finished. We are going to add some railways into this place, highways as well. I had to plan that in the beginning before I started building here. That was actually very painful, but I eventually managed, and now I finally have some kind of highway system planned for pretty much the rest of the city, which is kind of nice to have, I suppose. But yeah, it's just like illustrating how this place is so big that I pretty much need to plan the rest of the series, yeah, at this point already, and how it's going to connect to the rest of the city and all these kinds of things. So lots of work in front of us, which means that I'm not going to continue this project in the next episodes. Couple of episodes, because I would really like to return to the city center and do some changes there, all right? Because I was kind of planning that for a long time. I finally wanted to go for it, and this particular view is not exactly going to stay the same, oh yeah? So that's probably giving you some spoilers for the next episodes, but enough of that. Thank you guys for watching today's episode. Hope you liked it. Hope you learned something. If you did, then please do all the things below the video, the clicking, writing, subscribing, sharing, and these kinds of things. And huge thanks to the channel members who are directly supporting this channel, supporting me in what I'm doing over here. Thank you guys. Thanks again for watching. Take care and goodbye.